All right, welcome to A Growing Concern. During the run-up to the 2008 election, Barack Obama promised that he would revisit NAFTA. And as soon as he got elected, he grabbed that ring as it came around, and he never mentioned it. In fact, he tried to ram the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was a free trade arrangement of a lot of the Asian and Pacific Rim countries, and that was put a stop to by Donald Trump, and we'll get to that a little bit later. But right now there is negotiating going on with NAFTA, which we'll find out from our guest what all that means. And the United States is, I think, primarily pushing to make their position better than it was before. But anyway, we're gonna be talking with Russell Lum, who is the Trade Justice Coordinator for Oregon Free Trade Campaign. We've had folks from that organization on before, Elizabeth Swaggart and Arthur, a few years back. But welcome to the program.
Thank you, Jim.
I've heard you speak about this, and for your age, your years, you seem to be very well organized and understanding of this issue, which whenever I bring people on to talk about this, it just seems like almost like nuclear issues. It's just so complicated. But when you really get down to it, it's not very complicated. I know that in the early 90s, they say that a Republican couldn't have gotten NAFTA through, but Clinton did. And so just briefly, what is NAFTA? It's a North American Free Trade Agreement.
Yeah, exactly. The North American Free Trade Agreement has been in force since '94. It wrapped up its negotiation in '92, and the various legislatures of the three countries. It's a tri-country NAFTA zone. That's Mexico, Canada, and the U.S. And the various legislatures of those countries approved it in '93, and it went into force January 1, '94. And so the thrust of its negotiating years were under George H.W. Bush, and sort of the debut of NAFTA and its initial years were under Bill Clinton, who defined himself as a free trader Democrat, and that's a legacy that ran up through the Obama years for the Democratic Party and is an important battleground, obviously, for Democrats right now, and was in 2016,
Sure.
And that sort of thing. But NAFTA was an expansion of the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. Canada and the U.S. had one in the 80s, and they said the people who push the neoliberal, the liberalizing trend of the global economy decided to say, well, what if we introduce Mexico to the free trade zone between Canada and the U.S.? And it was really the first free trade agreement of any size that introduced a developing country into a trade agreement with highly developed countries.
So rather than just have a trade agreement with Mexico, they went in and had a trade agreement with all three at one time.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. But I think how different from prior trade agreements was, it was a trade agreement with countries that weren't on par developmentally.
Right.
Mexico being like in the third world, the so-called third world.
But they had a lot of oil.
Well, a lot of good stuff from the perspective of the people who exploit and extract.
Sure.
Yeah, and wanted to get in on that.
And labor being one of them.
And wanted to really disrupt and transform the nature of the Mexican economy. For a lot of Mexicans, it was an agrarian society, like I say, the economic orthodoxy of the day, which we're still living with in so many ways, was, no, let's transform the Mexican economy into one for export goods, and disrupt the norms around what was for many in Mexico an agrarian society. And this was an idea about industrializing Mexico, about helping Mexico leap into the industrial era. One of the things that I talk about sometimes is how Bill Clinton, in 2010, he kind of admitted that he was wrong about one aspect of U.S. trade policy in 2010. He said, quote, "Since the 1970s, the United States has followed a policy where we rich countries that produce food and overproduce food can grow it for the poor countries, sell it to the poor countries, relieve them of the burden of creating their own food, and thereby help them leap into the industrial era." Bill Clinton goes on to say in 2010, it didn't work. It didn't work, and I was party to it. Now, Bill Clinton is still a free trader Democrat, still stands by the legacy of NAFTA, but in that one sentence admits how it didn't work for Mexico. It created a highly imbalanced Mexican economy that was really about worker exploitation for the benefit of companies exterior to Mexico, which came in there to make their assembly plants, so that they had like you say, a ready, cheap labor force of Mexican folks who became, the maquiladora economy, became the auto economy for much of the world, in the sense that parts come into Mexico that create sort of the NAFTA auto economy. Mexico's highly essential. We can talk more about some of the labor costs on the Mexican economy, but the point is it was a highly disruptive, highly transformative thing that folks who push a free trade agenda on the world wanted and intended.
Well, it seems to me that if they were trying to create that type of industries down there, they're going to need workers. And they got those workers off the farms, because I understand that 1.2 million farmers lost their job. Yeah. I don't know about the figures, but you know that a lot of them did.
Yeah. When we talk about it, that is the figure that we use. Roughly, small farmers and farm workers to the tune of 2 million lost livelihoods in that sector, in the small farm sector, and were displaced. And by that meaning looking for jobs of a different sort in Mexico.
In Mexico City by the millions.
Right. Or the shanties, the colonias outside of northern Mexican towns, which became a kind of a specialty for the assembly economy of transnational corporations. Either displaced internally or, of course, immigrants properly crossing the border and as we know, like living in the shadows in this country.
Well, like I'll talk about on the show, we like to connect things up, but right away, two big connections. Immigration to this country became out of that, and of course, all what was going on in the northern Mexico, the drug trade.
Yeah.
All that was probably a consequence, if not only of this, but
disrupting a Mexican economy that for many was subsistence or used very local markets, and turning it into an economy for export goods. Certainly created the unhealthy economic imbalance, which I think did probably make for an expansion of the underground economy, the criminal economy, no question. But further, using the existence of the narcos, the existence of the cartels, as an excuse to militarize the society of Mexico, is another aspect of neoliberal forms of our economy, right? Squeeze workers, create fewer and fewer opportunities for people, and say, for humans there's a border, for companies and for goods there's no border. And I think that's to segment our labor markets so that folks can be exploited when they are supposedly cheap labor, and to keep them cheap labor. That's what that border's for. That's what militarizing it's for. That's what creating a police society, a police state in Mexico where there's extrajudicial killings and disappearances. It's to control those aspects, and to kind of bring the muscle of a long-term trend, a 30-year trend in some cases, of workers losing out and of it being harder for families.
It seems to me that what the NAFTA was doing down there was creating an economy that was better for some, but at the same time, it probably made the cost of living go up. It made it even harder on the folks that were coming from them farms.
Yeah, that's right. It cost
them more to live.
Yeah, that's right. Well, there's a ton of interesting examples as regards that. Cheap grains were overproduced in this country, and corn is like the most symbolic of which.
Crossed my mind a while
ago. Of course,
yes,
and other staples, other grains, overproduced in this country and dumped onto the Mexican market, kind of along the lines of the food policy that I was talking about in terms of the Bill Clinton quote. And so you have supposedly cheap grains that were grown from the U.S. perspective that were sold under the cost of production, which is the technical definition of dumping. And it becomes what Mexicans eat. One statistic is that in 1993, only 13% of Mexico's food supply was from imports. And in 2003, it was 40-some%, between 40 and 50%.
Tripled.
Yeah, tripled the amount that Mexicans were eating of international imported foods, right? Nonetheless, with all of that cheap grain coming into their country, the end products for corn skyrocketed in price. The price for tortillas, and this is just like one kind of anecdote, one example, the price for tortillas went up 279% in the NAFTA era. So the supposed cheap grains and the supposed benefit that free trade has on consumers really wasn't there, really was one of the broken promises of the whole deal. And meanwhile, grain trading companies and grain producing companies like Cargill, had exponentially greater profits. Cargill and the agribusiness society that it's a part of and that it kind of pushes and thrusts on the world is an interesting example. That's a company that between 98 and 2008, their net profits increased 660% in that period.
That's six times.
Raiding the economy on the basis of what for them was a NAFTA win, a NAFTA windfall.
And I imagine someone who was listening to us and say, well, yeah, but there was good things too. I mean, now all of the produce and foodstuffs from Mexico was coming this way. They were even talking about building a big super highway that would go up to someplace in Texas for distribution and all that.
Yeah.
I don't think any of that ever happened.
Yeah, that's a dead issue, that one.
Yeah.
But it is true that the people who defend the free trade legacy will try to tell you that that having international foods and all year round is a better thing, that consumers like that, or consumers should have that or deserve that. Of course, we're talking about which consumers. That the U.S. has become a consumption specializing economy, and Mexico has become an assembly specializing economy, and the disparity is unacceptable to people who believe in global justice. As an aside here, I'll give another stat, which is that incredibly, and free trade's a driver of this, the U.S. is 5% of the world's population. It's 20 to 25% of global consumption total.
Is that energy consumption or
total?
consumption
Every good. Yeah.
And also, what percentage of waste that they're kicking?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And so the people who are fond of, like I say, the legacy of free trade, they're going to say, well, now we can have tomatoes year round. Now we can have a great deal more avocados than we had before NAFTA of the 90s. And so yes. Highly mechanized, larger Mexican farms that grew tomatoes for export and avocados for export. Yes, we can concede, they're some of the winners of NAFTA. But agricultural sector that couldn't mechanize, indigenous folks, small farmers, like we've been saying, the people who didn't have the capital to mechanize, did not fare well and lost their farm livelihoods and had to be displaced.
Yeah, they're in some factory somewhere putting nuts on bolts. Probably.
More or less, yeah.
Yeah, that seems to be it. And also the USDA, for all their problems, they do tend to keep us safe from pesticides and things along the way that could possibly poison the people who eat the produce and the different things in this country. But the stuff coming across the border, I don't think goes through that sort of.
Yeah, that's another issue of NAFTA's. You bet. It makes our food less safe. In the respect that, what does this stuff mean? It means that for goods and for companies, the border's invisible. And like we're saying, for people, the border's not invisible. For people, the border keeps people where they are.
It's getting taller all the time.
Yeah, in fact. Or it punishes people for trying to cross it if they manage to, right?
If they manage not to die along the way.
Exactly. And the number of border deaths has increased since the late 90s at great lengths as well.
Probably because of global warming, maybe, and longer summers.
Well, and also because of policy that tried to drive immigration to the deserts and away from the more city ports of entry.
Oh, okay, right.
Yeah, that's a Bill Clinton era policy, and George W. Bush ramped it up rather quite a bit. The idea that the normal ports of entry, the traditional ports of entry like Tijuana and Ciudad Juarez, would be highly militarized, highly clamped down, in a way that drove folks who were looking to cross unauthorized to the desert, increasing migrant deaths, in really a scandal in that area. Yeah.
Well, we could go on forever with Mexico.
We
we're going to bring a little video on in a few minutes from now. But there's also the issues with NAFTA. Didn't it kind of hollow out some parts of this country, like the textiles in parts of this country? And moving away from that for the time being anyway, how did Canada fare?
Sure.
And they didn't have the issues because they're a first world country, probably.
Yeah. And I'm remembering now, just to mention from the prior question, what this, trade policy is negotiated sector by sector. In the big rooms where this stuff matters for the people who, let's say, run the world, they sit down in a room that talks about textiles. They sit down in a room that talks about autos. They sit down in a room that talks about
it's all compartmentalized.
Services of some kind, financial services, and so forth. And then the chapters of a trade agreement result, which determine what's going to move and how much content of that sector is going to be able to move across the border. And what they're basically deciding is that for textiles, there is no border. For cars, if you're a car produced in Mexico, you may as well have been a car produced in the United States. That's the sort of like the so-called NAFTA car instead of an American-made car or whatever, a NAFTA car. And so, yeah, making the border invisible. And that's one of the ways that our food has become less safe, like you were saying with the USDA. It's like, the laws that we pass to protect food safety, to protect public health, we have to accept a Mexican agricultural product that crosses the border under NAFTA obligations, despite perhaps not bearing the standard that we had voted on as a country into the USDA or other forms, and that's what they do. But the way that it's affected the other industries, well, compare the wages that folks are making when they make jeans or something in Mexico versus when they make jeans in the United States. And this was one of like the big NAFTA stories of the late 90s, which is for instance, the jeans company Guess, like luxury goods and denim. And Guess proudly made a lot of their jeans in Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. And this is a company that was in trouble with the union, Unite, and basically said, you know what? We are taking a lot of heat from working people, from labor power in Los Angeles. We're going to pick up and move our operation to Mexico. Copy the model. Treat people on the same formula of squeezing workers. Just do it where they can get away with it, and do it where they can make skyrocketing profits, because the Mexican wage would be like $1 an hour in the late 90s for making jeans, as opposed to something more like $9 an hour for making jeans in Los Angeles. Yeah, and so this is the model, and Canada has suffered under the model as well, just in the same way that the big auto companies in the U.S. have seen job loss to Mexico. Auto companies in Canada the same, and squeezing workers seems not to have a border, right? The neoliberal model is not interested in that, and so yeah, the loss of the weakening of union power, the same way that we talk about it in this country, it has gone on in Canada. Yeah.
Well, it's been where we have recently been in touch with one another. Is it a labor history for activists? I wouldn't call it a speech, but classes, I guess.
Yeah.
And I'm learning a lot about what's going on with this, and I forget what the statistics are, but isn't labor union membership like half of what it was in the 70s?
Oh, a great deal less. Yeah.
So you can put a lot of that onto free trade agreements then.
I think. Well, yeah, you can put that on the larger trends of which free trade is a pusher,
This
right?
is one of them.
Yes, exactly. So nationally, it's single digits how many workers are in unions, and
Really?
that hasn't been the case. Right. In Oregon, we're more like 16% or something. Oregon's workforce is unionized at like 16%.
Sure.
But the decline is dramatic, and it means that transforming nature of work, people work longer hours for less. People are able to be told by their employer, well, we could move this job across a southern border. We could move this job to Mexico or Central America, and you'd have nothing. So you'll certainly say goodbye to your pension, won't you, or your benefits, and whatnot. And so yeah, the trend has had all kinds of implications in terms of internationalizing and liberalizing the global economy.
Sure, I see that. And also the conservative movement, the right-wing movement has managed to really demonize unions, specifically the teachers' union. Seems like, and it seems like it's getting worse all the time, and they're becoming more and more successful. Not that is the only way this has been going down the road, but that has been a very deliberate target.
Yeah, well, public sector workers, have been no exception to the weakening of unions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and it just recently here I haven't tried to connect up with anybody yet, but we have teacher union negotiations going on right here in Portland right now.
We do, yeah, we do.
And I don't know how that's going, but it probably can't be going well because it's still going on.
Yeah.
The way it looks like to me. Well, all that makes a lot of sense, and we could go on and on. I mean, NAFTA's created an awful lot of issues in a lot of different ways. Going overseas is another one, and you mentioned the food and all that. I know that when you were on this program with Dan Shea and Paige and Page out there in Metro East, she was on to talk about, was it Coca-Cola? No, it was GM.
Yes,
So,
GM's treatment of its in its subsidiary in Colombia of injured workers in Bogota, Colombia.
Right, and there was some folks came through a few years ago that had a website called Killer Coke, where Coca-Cola, labor activists were disappearing, and I think half the labor activists that died in the whole planet were in Colombia.
Right.
And then General Motors, people were being damaged at work, and they were being just kicked to the curb. Yeah. And this is all because they're able to do that.
Yeah.
And NAFTA and the United States government turning their back on what's going on down there, allowed to do that because of the NAFTA agreements, right?
Yeah. It doesn't seem, Jim, that ever accumulating exorbitant private wealth is killing the poor. And in this country, it kills the poor through these healthcare reforms, or these attempted healthcare reforms, or these healthcare sabotages, or through tax policy, and through other impacts, through environmental justice impacts. But in some of our sister countries in the Americas, it's killing the poor directly through extrajudicial killings, assassinations of organizers. Colombia has seen a really calamitous rise of the threat to the lives of people who stand up for workers, and Mexico too.
Mm-hmm. And even though Colombia isn't Mexico, after the NAFTA agreements, I know that there was following the WTO snafu. Well, it wasn't a snafu for the people, but it was a snafu for the World Trade Organization up in Seattle in November of 1999.
Yep.
They started trying to, I forget the name of a lot of the trade agreements, but they started trying to get trade agreements with Panama, and I think there was one they were meeting in Florida, was supposed to be hooking up 23 different countries.
Yes,
they put a stop to that.
The FTAA, the Free Trade Area of the Americas.
Yeah,
yes.
And that they started doing that. The free traders, I guess you could call them, were trying to hook up to different countries, either in groups or one at a time, and they did the same thing with South Korea. So this has been going on, for quite some time, and they've been relatively successful getting all this done.
Right. Well, and doesn't it seem the case that they enrich sort of an upper crust of a society that's highly poor and for which there's no social justice, in a manner that gets what they want, right? For international capital to invest, that's what they call it, but it's exploiting or extracting in the case of resources. Yeah, and you're right. I think when the Free Trade Area of the Americas fell apart in 2005. There was a change to nonetheless get what they want, but through these bilateral deals. Colombia Free Trade Agreement and the Peru Free Trade Agreement and so forth.
Sure. Well, I know Barbara Dudley, who's been on before talking about this. She's a real smart lady. She was talking about how they'll have these meetings that you're talking about, maybe here and there in these different sectors. But the first world countries will have 50 lawyers, and Panama will have 2 or something like that. Or when a country is sued, because there was a country down there that sued because the mining that was going on was devastating the local population through pollution, they put a stop to it, and then of course that company sued.
Yeah, El Salvador.
And there you are with three lawyers against 50 of them. And so those were it was a company would be allowed to sue a country, and that was all part of the TPP as well. But to me, that was one of the most egregious parts of NAFTA, and I think Bill Moyers actually did a documentary on that. And that was probably one of the most devastating aspects of it, where your local sovereignty, whether local being in metro or state or federal, you're giving it away.
That's exactly right. Yeah, and NAFTA kind of wrote the book on bringing that provision into large trade agreements. NAFTA was really the first to do it, and we call it investor-state dispute settlement, ISDS, or investor-state dispute resolution. But it is the particular corporate, grab or handout, if you like, or giveaway, if you like, where corporations can sue governments, and it's not reciprocal. The governments can't sue the corporations, and workers can't sue corporations. But corporations can sue governments when they had made an investment, which in their mind is to say they had an expectation of profit, and some governmental action, and like you said, at any level, regional or national government, when that expectation of profit gets cut into by a government action, they use trade rules, they use the ISDS provisions in the relevant trade agreement or the relevant trade authority to challenge it and to squeeze settlements or to squeeze awards, financial awards in the millions of dollars from those governments because they dared pass some public interest law that apparently cut into corporate profit. Imagine that, right?
Yeah, that's even ran. United States has ran afoul of that. I think California wanted to put something additive in the gas or not put it in, and they got sued by, I think it was Canada or something. I don't
That's
know.
right. Yes, a Canadian. Yeah, that's a really like you say, egregious case when California banned the gasoline additive that its public health advocates and its scientists determined was highly destructive, not something they want Californians to have to breathe. They banned this gasoline additive, and a Canadian oil company sued under NAFTA. Yeah.
And so, Canada, who it's a large country, but they just don't have the power that the United States has. Well, was it Canada that sued, or was it a company that sued?
Right. So this is one of those situations where it's not a balanced adversarial like litigation. It's a corporation versus a company. And so a Canadian corporation sued the United States government, and the United States government is held liable for what its sub-regional governments do, right? What the California state government does, the United States lawyers have to own up for in international trade courts.
And that's the World Trade Organization, isn't it?
Well, it can be. It can be under the WTO rules, at least when when companies have to litigate with other companies over trade rules. But no, in that case, it's a NAFTA case. It's an ISDS case. But we can talk about the ways that trade rules seem completely obscene and egregious. I mean, just 2 years ago, year and a half ago, something like this. India was undergoing kind of a solarization of their energy economy. It was considered to be very good for India. It was creating a lot of solar jobs. The government was subsidizing Indian-made, which is to say, domestic-made solar panels for its solar revolution. And this is a protectionist policy. It ran afoul of the WTO rules. And the United States made a country-to-country suit under the WTO rules. So the United States sued India and said, you can't do that. You can't protect your homemade solar panel industry. And it came before a WTO court because it's international law, and India has to stand for its economic policy, right? At least according to the trade regimes that we live under. And so when India gave its defense, it said, look, this is how we're going to make our economy a renewable energy economy. We need this initiative, this subsidy initiative, to meet our obligations under the Paris Climate Accord. We need this initiative to meet our obligations under the UN Framework for Climate Change. And the WTO adjudicators ruled climate change agreements do not outweigh trade rules. The United States wins. That's not a good enough defense.
Sure. I don't think the WTO has ever found for whoever that was, El Salvador, or for the people who are trying to protect their labor or protect their environment. I don't think they ever found for them, have they? It's always been
here and there, the result, which we would consider to be better, in a really messed up situation where a trade regime has to adjudicate between something that would be beneficial to the public and something that would be a corporate power grab. Here and there, what we would consider to be better has won.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Well, that's good news. But it's usually probably in small cases. Though.
Sure. And it's along the lines of a system that, like we say, has been in force since NAFTA in '94 and is in force in the TPP, although the U.S., of course, is not a party to the TPP. It's ongoing, and it's not fair ground to be fighting on.
Well, heck, we're halfway through the program
Here
already.
we are.
And we've got a little video clip. Before we play that, you talk a little bit about the clip, what it's about. No, it's about the renegotiating NAFTA, which is what we're going to get to next.
Sure. Yeah, NAFTA is in renegotiation for the first time and only time in its history. And Witness for Peace Mexico, which is an organization and a partner organization to ours, put together a 5-minute video to analyze the renegotiation, to ask and answer what has NAFTA cost Mexico. So that's what this video is about.
All right, good deal. Well, we'll get to that video and be back.
Since NAFTA was approved in 1994, the worst trade deal ever made by any country, I think, in the world.
We are going to renegotiate the worst trade deal ever made in the history, not of our country, in the history of the world. NAFTA.
NAFTA.
NAFTA. NAFTA. NAFTA. Anybody ever hear of NAFTA?
I'd also like to welcome here the representatives from Mexico and Canada and tell them they are, in fact, welcome here. They are our partners in the future that we are trying to make together.
NAFTA has been a horrible deal for the United States. It's been very good for Canada. It's been very good for Mexico.
Creo que empezamos a vivir las consecuencias del TLC en el año, 2-3 años antes de que entrara, por ahí de los 90, justo con el gobierno de Carlos Salinas.
El Tratado de Libre Comercio de América del Norte ha traído una serie de implicaciones para la vida comunitaria. Desde hace aproximadamente 30 años esto ha sido paulatino y progresivo. Se ha recrudecido la pobreza en el país. En Oaxaca es un caso específico. La privatización de los bienes comunes, la privatización de los bienes que en un momento estaban en manos de comunidades indígenas, ahora se están colocando bajo los intereses empresariales e intereses transnacionales.
En el ámbito educativo, bueno, no estamos exentos de una cuestión catastrófica, ya que al renegociarse el Tratado de Libre Comercio va a permitir la entrada libre de todas las empresas mineras, y que nosotros creemos y estamos seguros que es el fin último de todas las reformas estructurales que han implementado en el país.
A partir de que el Telecán entra en vigor, se abre el mercado a las transnacionales. Empezamos desde lo que es el campo hasta lo que es la medicina. Entonces, ¿qué es lo que pasa? El campo recibe un golpe, un tiro de gracia. Si ya lo habían dejado que empezara a morir, el Telecán viene a darle el tiro de gracia. ¿Por qué? Porque el campesino común no pudo competir contra la infraestructura que tiene Estados Unidos o Canadá.
Es lamentable la situación de la llegada de todos los megaproyectos mineros, proyectos eólicos y las zonas económicas especiales, que es un famoso desarrollo, el cual pues no trae más que la destrucción de las comunidades, la destrucción de nuestra madre tierra. Esta situación de los proyectos pues ha traído muerte para personas que defendemos la tierra y el territorio.
I've seen.
Sure,
Oh,
sure.
I think we're back already. That was quick. Am I all plugged in and ready to go? Great. Well, we could go 40 different directions at this point, and but we should probably move it into the direction of the renegotiations and what the United States is trying to get out of this. And I'm sure they're not trying to make it easier for the folks in Mexico and Canada.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it definitely changed the United States' line as it tries to negotiate trade with other countries when Donald Trump really rose, right? When Donald Trump became president, completely flipped the script on how the United States is approaching trade policy. And the Trump administration is battling out still, which side of its identity, if you will hold sway when it comes down to what it's going to argue for in trade policy, what its trade vision is. It's sort of a two-headed monster, really, that is battling for air inside the Trump administration over whether to be nationalist or whether to be corporatist and sort of follow the line that Democrats and Republicans had for decades prior.
Well, it isn't like he really understands any of this, I wouldn't think. So it just depends on who he wants to listen to that day.
Right. Well, he took a big bludgeon to NAFTA over in the campaign. And in one clip or another, Trump actually tells you himself, I ran a campaign largely based on NAFTA. Those are his words.
Really?
He knows how important it was to his narrative. He knows how important it was to being elected on some working class votes of people who have been hurt by the free trade of the last 30 years. He's perfectly aware that that's where some of his power comes from. And he also, the image-conscious aspect of himself, the insecure aspect of himself, also wants to look like he's done right by some of these workers. And I think that's true. He wants to look like he is helping people who are hurting.
Like in coal. That's what that's all about.
But and so many of his policies are folly.
And they're going to hurt the same people he's trying to court.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. But nonetheless, some aspects of Trump's thrust on trade is to protect U.S. manufacturing. It's protectionist in some ways, but it's protectionist in a manner that blames other countries, that perceives, like we saw in the video, that other countries have been doing well under NAFTA, and it's just a matter of having been cheated for 23 years.
That we've been cheated.
That the United States has been cheated against Mexico, right? And it's pitting us U.S. workers against those Mexican workers, if you will, in an effort to try to reclaim what was lost by capitalist means towards what was lost by the very problems of a globalizing capitalism. And so Trump's team, in some manner, is this economic nationalist agenda that claims we've been cheated and has to end that, has to balance the scales.
Economic nationalism,
yeah.
That says a lot right there. I can understand that. So that's just part and parcel of his wanting to put the wall up. It's all the same mechanism.
Exactly. And economic nationalism has its twin in white nationalism too. But I think that's exactly right. But nonetheless, there's also, Trump, the international businessman, and certain aspects of Trump's administration who want to continue the agenda of free trade, want to enrich the companies that have been getting rich all these years, right? And so, I think when people say, and you'll still hear members of Congress say, our own here in Oregon say, we still don't know what Trump's going to do on trade. We still don't know what Trump's going to do on NAFTA. That's why. But after all, some of the things that he's been at the table with Mexico and Canada and asking for in the negotiation just last month, some of them, the results would be halfway decent from our perspective. Trump did make an attempt to propose to Mexico and Canada to take the teeth out of investor-state dispute settlement. That's halfway decent. Now, it's for the wrong reasons, and it's for a wrong total vision of economic prosperity.
So what you're saying, it'll seem good in the beginning, but down the road it won't be as good.
Sure. Well, I mean, it'll be an open question as to who will really win if you're not doing things for the right reasons and with the right strategy and the right end result in mind. So instead of an economy that works for all across borders, instead of an economy that makes sure that folks have a living wage, instead of an economy that makes sure that the products that people produce are valued and that they're traded fairly, instead of that vision, it's let's hoodwink workers more Let's play on people's fears more. Let's play on people's sense of a legacy of having been cheated of things.
Fear of immigrants.
For instance, yes, yeah. And see how much political gains he may make by that. And so Trump's no savior of working people, and we have no intention of letting him make any political gains, political wins off of that narrative. But that is some of what he's bringing to Mexico and Canada, and it's causing the NAFTA negotiation to go rather poorly. Now, I think that the threats that the NAFTA negotiation might so crumble and be an end of the NAFTA zone are not something to bank on, and not something to believe that it makes our work any easier. As organizers of working people, as organizers of people who stand up for our environment and for human rights, for the rights of migrants, Trump's not making our work any easier. And that work still to be done. It has to be cross-border because you have to lift up everyone in an economy that's hurting, especially when the companies that are doing the hurting are using, like I was saying, the same formula to hurt folks in the U.S. and hurt folks in Mexico. Like AT&T is a company that operates both in the United States and Mexico, has electrical workers in the United States and in Mexico doing the same work, and eating away at worker gains and undercutting union movements and undercutting independent union growth, both sides of the border. So you have to lift up everyone who's hurting.
Sure.
And that means cross-border solidarity and stuff like that.
I was wondering while you were speaking. Now, is this NAFTA? Now, is this running out and it has to be renegotiated, and it'll just, or is this a situation where they're just revisiting it to bring it up to date, but it's still in effect?
Yeah, NAFTA is in effect now. There was no schedule for a renegotiation period. But President Trump called NAFTA the worst deal in the U.S. history, the world history, whatever. He called it a lot of things, but railed against it, and I think then cornered himself by that fact into having to do something about it. The thing that he managed to do about it then is to call Canada and Mexico to the table to renegotiate it, and Mexico and Canada felt dragged probably into the renegotiation. There are certain folks who were not interested in a renegotiation, thought that the economy was working fine, right? Like the agribusiness sector, why renegotiate NAFTA?
Yeah.
Do no harm is what you'll hear them say now. Do no harm if you're going to mess with NAFTA. But so Trump, it seems to me, he backed himself into a corner to have to do something about this trade policy. And it honors some aspects of his nationalism to do something about this trade policy. And so that's why we have a renegotiation, and they expect it to go into 2018. The people who are renegotiating NAFTA want it to wrap up soon because they want it to be part of the current Mexican president's legacy, and his term runs out soon, and he may be replaced by someone who would take NAFTA in an utterly different direction. So Enrique Peña Nieto, the president of Mexico, wants to wrap up a NAFTA negotiation before summer of 2018.
So he's got term limits and he's done?
Yeah, and that's how they do it in Mexico, is a 6-year term limit for any president.
Well, at least he won't be the one having to pay for the wall, huh?
Yeah, none of them will pay for the wall, whether conservative or leftist in Mexico. None of them are doing that.
Yeah. Well, that was just, I don't think he really expected that to happen. He was just pushing people's buttons. And he's really good at that. I mean, in a lot of ways, he's got some real behavior issues, but at the same time, he's pretty astute understanding of human nature.
Well, yeah, when it comes to picking fights, when it comes to aggravating people's emotions, to support him, the demagoguery sort of stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah. So they come together to negotiate like about every month. About every month they come together for like 5 days or so.
They meaning
the 3 countries negotiators.
Right. And
Mexico, Canada, and the U.S. They come together in one of the cities of one of the 3 countries. The upcoming one will be in Mexico City. The one following that be back in the U.S., I think. And so they work out a NAFTA text, but they're struggling because Trump's bringing a nationalist agenda, bringing a protectionist agenda in some measure that Mexico and Canada are having trouble swallowing or threatening their own sort of disgust over the whole process.
Are they doing it the same way, where each industry is doing it separate, like they were?
Chapter
before?
by chapter. That's how they negotiate it.
So that makes it really complicated.
Right, and there are certain things that they've said. Well, here's where we already have agreement, and here's where we don't have agreement yet. And on enforcement and things like ISDS is where they don't have agreement, is what we're learning. And where they do, apparently, is things like oil and gas. Well, so Mexico had a nationalized oil sector, and that's changed. One of the legacies of the current Mexican administration is to privatize oil. And so they're going to write into the new NAFTA all these protections for companies that want to internationally, come into Mexico and invest in the oil sector, own and exploit in the oil and gas sector. So that they agree on. All three countries think that's fine because
big bucks in that.
Yeah, of course. Trump is such a fossil fuel president, and Canada, the leaders of Canada have long been fossil fuel leaders, and so
unfortunately,
yeah, and so they agree on things like oil and gas. They agree on some other chapters that they've said, okay, we're good. But there's a lot still to work out, and it's contested ground that we are trying to contest as well, to ensure that that workers stop being exploited by this 30 and 40-year model of exploitation. And so we are trying to, at Oregon Fair Trade and our sister organizations and Citizens Trade Campaign and Global Trade Watch and so forth, trying to tell a narrative that says, we do want to be a modern global economy, but for workers. We don't want to be nativist or protectionist or nationalist per se. We want to be globalist, but about rights, and not investor rights, but rights of people, and defense of our planet. And that's, like I say, the Trump administration, as it goes through this process, is a two-headed monster of corporatism and economic nationalism. And so, with those in the air, hard to get some space, but have been doing that all the while, and going back to, like you were mentioning, the big globalization protests of the late 90s. I mean, these are still the issues. We still need to globalize rights.
And everything kind of went away when Obama came in, so that's all going to have to start over again. I've always said that, the transition from Bush to Obama was seamless. There really wasn't that much of a difference. He was still, drones. He was still doing a lot of the things that George Bush did. It's just that he had, there was a different face on it. And a lot of that organizing went away. I'm glad you guys didn't.
Right, well said, yeah.
But a few organizations, they weakened during that time. Now they're finding they're having to start it all over again. Well, I see we're down a little over 10 minutes. So like I said earlier, we've got a temporary phone set up. Folks, haven't been in the habit of being able to call in for a few months. So maybe you do, maybe you don't, but hope you do, because this is a large issue, as you've seen. There's a lot of questions you might have. You might have some comments. You might think that things are fine the way they are with NAFTA. You might think they're not. And the different programs I've done on these different issues over the many, many years we've been talking about this, since November of 1999, just before the WTO is when I first became aware of all this. NAFTA needs to be revisited, but it doesn't need to have economic nationalism injected into it, for one thing. That just scares the hell out of me, because we have that whole mentality taking root in Europe too. With some of the right wing and the Brexit and the different things that are going on. This is something that's happening, and it happened decades ago. I remember when there was during the rise of Hitler and Mussolini and Franco in Spain, and these things tend to be cyclical. Absolutely. And we need to stop this before it gets moving. The more was that a flash? I think we might have a phone call. First caller, you're on the air. Sometimes it's bumpy.
My name's
here.
David. I was wondering if, first of all, thanks very much for having Russell on the program.
Hey, you're welcome.
He has really got a real great grasp of all of these questions. So,
he sure does.
My wish is that Russell would kind of tell us about how our U.S. senators and how our U.S. representatives are feeling about the renegotiation of NAFTA.
And where they stand on that issue. All right. Well, thank you for the question. Basically that leads right into what people can do, which is an important the important aspect about all this, right?
And so Oregon Fair Trade, we're a grassroots statewide advocacy organization. We take it to be our job to pull the right strings to convince our decision makers in Washington not to fall down on their commitments to workers and to the environment. And our decision makers in Washington, as the caller said, are our members of Congress. That's who we got. And our members of Congress, the trade issue does seem to split the Democrats, doesn't it?
It does.
And
it doesn't the other side, though.
Well, yeah, generally not. Although the Republicans have among them their own nationalists, like we're talking about.
Correct.
Yeah. But we are watching very carefully how the Democratic Party, particularly in the Senate, you hear Chuck Schumer talking about a better deal. This is something of recent months that he has said, that the Democratic Party at the national level is going to become a workers' party again, and here are the planks. And some of them are very favorable on trade. Some of them are very positive, to say that we're going to listen to what unions tell us on what's hurting workers in these big trade deals.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is a sense that Minority Leader Schumer is trying to change his party, or trying to recapture some votes that perhaps were lost from the Democratic perspective in the 2016 primary that went to the independent Bernie Sanders, because he stood on the right issues.
And there was Democrats that voted for Trump too during the main election.
Yeah, that's true. Yes, and so that's true. And so mainline Democrats like the Minority Leader Schumer are trying to recapture voters that may have gone for Trump, or in that other case may have gone for Sanders, and kind of redefine the Democratic Party as a group that's going to try to earn that vote. And a lot of people unconvinced. But they're trying, right? And so the lines being drawn, and the sort of the trade battleground in the Democratic Party is very, very interesting.
Very jagged.
Yeah. So nonetheless, our senators here in Oregon, Senator Ron Wyden is a trade expert, and he's well listened to both in Washington and otherwise on trade issues.
Mm-hmm.
He's the ranking Democrat on the Senate Finance Committee, and what he says about trade reverberates.
He's been there forever.
Mm-hmm, long time, and wants to see trade agreements be transparent, and wants to see our enforcement of international labor law strengthened, and to his credit. But other than that, there's still a lot of distance to work with Senator Wyden as well on things like investor-state dispute settlement. So that's how that looks. Senator Jeff Merkley, from our perspective, votes on trade the right way.
Mm-hmm.
You can say, well, we've got these members of Congress who are our trade champions, if you will. They've tended to say the right things on trade, and then we've got other Democrats that all too often, maybe after all, will be in the sway of the people who push a free trade agenda, like Nike, instead of Nike's workers, wherever they may be in the world, whether that's Mexico and Nike produces in Mexico,
Thailand,
whether
Vietnam.
that's Vietnam, or whether that's El Salvador and Nike produces in El Salvador, and so on. That's what we do, is we watch that line for where the Democrats are standing on trade, and seeing that they don't let us down, because after all, the legacy of free trade is, after all, unpopular. And that explains the rise of Donald Trump in a way. And that explains the popularity of Bernie Sanders in a way. And so with trade being unpopular, it's one of these issues, and healthcare is another, honestly, where there's disparity between what the public would want and what the public says when they're polled, and how far our own elected officials who vote in our name, whose jobs exist to serve us, what they do in Washington. There's a difference there.
Mm-hmm. Well, that made me think when I really thank the commenter again too, because this is an important issue. So these folks are meeting and these are whatever lawyers or whatever people that are doing all this, and but the actual legislation has to go through our folks in Washington D.C. Now it's just going through the Senate and the House.
Mm-hmm.
So everybody, we have 5 different folks here, and we have not like some issues. We have, like you were saying, there's a disparity. I know that, but I'm thinking of the fellow's name down not Eugene, but Salem. He'd probably be for it. Schrader, that's the one. He might as well be a Republican. But I think he would probably be on board with a lot of what the
favorable to free trade he is.
Free trade, and I know that the Bonamicis, and even I've been in rallies and protests at Blumenauer's office before, trying to push him in the right direction.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's the deal. You got it.
This is we're pretty good on the Senate level, but we're not looking so good on the on the House of Representatives. It seems like so that's where people should be really pushing hard, I would think.
Yeah, well, we encourage that. You know, we know that free trade's hurt people in Oregon. We know that more than 60,000 jobs have been lost in Oregon directly due to trade in the NAFTA era. That's how many have been certified by the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program. More than 60,000 people have had their livelihoods uprooted, have had their probably very good wages uprooted from them due to trade policy. And so people know that trade hurts us, and including, you know, the folks who live in this state who are in the shadows because maybe they were displaced because their economies couldn't sustain them back in Mexico or wherever it may have been, you see. So we know that free trade hurts Oregon, and the people like that should raise a voice. They should find us and do that with us.
Well, you know that, like you mentioned, 60,000. I don't know what industries necessarily were lost, and wouldn't this renegotiation of NAFTA afford the potential to create new industries or encourage new industries?
The renegotiation, well,
you know, like with the global warming and the alternative energy.
Sure. What I would like to see is a trade policy that would be favorable to subsidizing the green energy revolution, right? The idea that we need to get off of an addicted to fossil fuel and energy infrastructure.
You got the words. It's what I was thinking. You got the words there. It's exactly it, because that's the future. You know, we're still, what is it? Tom Hartman says, you know, we're burning the dinosaurs, you know, the oil, ancient sunlight or whatever, which is what is going on with this petroleum. But here we are, a little over a minute left. So thank you for coming on the program. You've brought a lot of instruction to me anyway, and I hope the viewers out there, and apparently the fellow that called in might have known you, but it was an important question that what to go from here, and that's usually where we go to the end of the program. So we got about a minute left. Do you want to kind of sum up an hour of talking here?
Sure. Well, so glad to have been here, Jim, and to talk about what we talk about all over the state, because this is such an important issue right now. Folks should follow the moves of this Trump administration as it navigates a really tricky trade policy. But don't get in the weeds too deep with which business will benefit over which business. Look for where workers are saying that they're being left out, and they're doing that in Mexico, and we're doing that here.
And there was a couple websites. One was your OregonFairTrade.org.
That's the deal. Find us there. Yep.
And there's also Witness for Peace.
Yes, well, at witnessforpeace/replace-NAFTA, you can find that video that we aired.
Right, and Witness for Peace. And also, I think Public Citizen has things on their website.
Great resources there.
And Alliance for Democracy, whether it's the larger one or the Portland one. All these have, perspectives on this. So I want to thank you again for coming on the program, Russell, and I want to thank the crew.